I'm very, very pleased tonight to welcome Amina Mohammed to us at the Hertie School. Amina Mohammed is a special advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations on the post-2015 development planning and the agenda. And truly, frankly speaking, that's going to be the agenda of the Hertie School students and your generation. Looking forward for the next 15 years is what we are going to discuss tonight. And people like us, we were involved in 2000 when the 2015 agenda was formulated. Now we look for the agenda for the next generation. So we are particularly pleased, we talked about that prior to the session, that we have such a large number also of younger people with us. Amina Mohammed comes to us with a wealth of experience in the public sector, in the private sector, with civil society. In her own country, Nigeria, she was the senior special assistant to the president, and it was 3 presidents over a 6-year period, for the implementation of the MDGs. And that's actually quite noteworthy that a country makes the MDG agenda in its own country a special focus of the presidents. And in Nigeria in particular, there was a 1 billion annual fund which was constituted as part of the debt relief process, but then was specifically used for the implementations of the MDG. And under that fund, numerous poverty reduction approaches were tested and implemented. Amina has also worked in numerous other international assignments, particularly on education and gender, and attends a number of panels. And certainly important for my colleagues and myself here at the Hertie School, she's also one of us. She leads a think tank, and she is, like myself, an adjunct professor in the Columbia University. I myself am an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and visiting professor here at Hertie. So we are particularly pleased to have you here as a practitioner, as a global leader, and as an academics communicating with our community here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hartmann. And I would say, Anne, as a woman, and there are so many women in this room, so this makes me really feel very excited about it. I've spent the best part of a day in the Development Committee Forum, and it was full of men. In fact, we were almost, we were a species that were about to be extinct, I think, at the DCF. So thank you very much. Thank you to the school. This is a real privilege to be here. When a colleague of mine said this opportunity was available, coming to attend a conference is important because these are important players in defining what we do with the post-2015 development agenda. But even more important, any opportunity I get to speak to young people, because for me, this is an incredible privilege to be part of shaping the new development agenda, having tried to work on a prescription called the MDGs for 10 years or so. This time, it's one that we're supposed to own, so I'm really looking forward to an agenda that is compelling, that is robust, and that will really meet the challenges and complexities of the world today, so that I can go home to Nigeria and try to help implement that. But I think most importantly, it's about handing over that baton to young people for whom this is going to be the best part of your careers. You are going to be carrying the burden of the next development agenda. I think never more so than now, because it is about a global and a universal development agenda. It's not about North and South, and so therefore you wouldn't hear too much about it, but it's also about the lives and the complexities and challenges that you also face in the North. So it's very much a universal one, and that in itself is a huge challenge for people to begin to understand, is that how do I look at myself in the mirror and not think poverty all the time down there, governance down there. It really is about all of us, and we are now very much in the same boat, and we can see that on a number of issues. So I'm really happy to be here and really discussing the importance of peace, the rule of law, governance. These are new aspects of the development agenda that we didn't have an opportunity to see in the MDGs. And so Now it's often people will ask, so how are you going to do this and how are you going to fit this? And the truth is that I'm not going to do it. We're going to do it. The whole point of a process that member states and governments claimed for their own to lead and to own is that we should do this together. We need to think about it together. We need to look at the implications. Nobody is going to prescribe any of this to us. It has to be from the wealth of knowledge and experience and expertise that we bring this forth. But we also have to listen to young people. We have to listen to people who are about to embark upon a journey of making their own impact in the development world. And that, I think, is more importantly why we should take the opportunities that we're given here. I'm going to start by sharing a little of my experiences, because I think the one thing that has given rise to us discussing the post-2015 agenda is the fact that whether we say the glass is half full, quarter full, almost empty, the MDGs worked because they've got us talking about the post-2015 agenda. If they hadn't, nobody would have even looked at it. And I have to say, a year and a half ago, when I joined the UN to do this, there were a lot of skepticism about whether we could in fact engage with sustainable development as an agenda, given that we hadn't yet reached the MDGs. And I remember leaving home and the president asking me, well, so does this mean we've done the MDGs now that you're going off to do SDGs? No, far from it. My experience with the MDGs, I think perhaps the first thing to say is that I actually didn't like them. I thought they were a terrible thing that had come to visit us in 2000 in Nigeria. I was very much about the Education for All agenda. It was something that UNESCO had put out. We had done Jomtien. We had come to Dakar. We had reaffirmed our support for a much bigger agenda for education. And then we were all coming home to get government to do the right thing. In fact, we made so much noise in civil society in Nigeria, we were told to come in and produce an education plan for our country. So we had 8 EFA goals at the beginning of 2000. By the time we got to the end of 2000, we had 1 and a bit, because we had been shrunk in this new agenda called the MDGs. So we were a bit furious. We kept saying this is minimalist. Where is it? What has happened? Things have gone terribly wrong. And then to make it worse, I had the president ask me to come and do the MDGs. So I thought, oh, right, now I'm in real trouble. How do I like these things? But we did have one thing. We had fought very hard for debt relief in a country that had been through military rule, that had seen many of its institutions really collapse under military rule, that had also seen democracy come where people thought the dividends would be had overnight. So very, very high expectations. Spent the best part, the first president I served, Obasanjo, just trying to keep the country together, to give them a reason why democracy was a good thing. We were embarking upon it again, and this really had to be deepened. So the $1 billion per annum that we got in savings, we dedicated towards trying to do something on the MDGs. And so the MDGs were a good entry point for us really translating to the international community what we were doing, that they were not giving debt relief that was going to go down a black hole, given our track record on governance. That was really important to them. I mean, Germany played a big role in allowing us the Paris Club deal that got us the debt relief. But I thought more importantly at that time was to tell Nigerians that things were going to change, that if we had public resources and we were going to put them through a public system, that they were actually going to reach Nigerians, and Nigerians were going to feel the benefit of it. And I do have to say that, $1 billion per annum might seem like a lot of money, but it's a drop in the ocean for what is required to deliver the MDGs in Nigeria. So we, right from the onset, did not say this was going to deliver MDGs. This was going to be additionality to the budget, try to use it for helping with the reform that we had. We had a public sector reform, trying to rebuild institutions, and we also had a public expenditure reform, trying to do better with our own resources and plug all the leakages that we had. So we did have huge challenges. We didn't think, many people, really didn't envy us the job of coming into government to try to spend money through the system. We could have taken the $1 billion, put it in a special fund, and just done projects. We took the more difficult decision of saying that if this was going to work, it's about government delivering service. So we must put it through the sectors. We must put it through the institutions. And maybe as we are putting it in, on the job, we begin to fix the institutions. And that, again, a tall order, and I will go through a number. We spent the first year putting our virtual poverty fund in place, and I will say that actually the lesson we took for the virtual poverty fund was going to Tanzania to find out how theirs was working. The UK government had told us that that's the best place to go. Go to Tanzania or go to Uganda. They're doing the virtual poverty fund really well, and Nigeria could learn from that. The Tanzanians were, of course, horrified. What were these Nigerians coming to Tanzania to do? We had so much money, and we had this huge delegation because Nigeria is big in every way. And we arrived at a time when they made a special dispensation for us. Tanzania received at that time, over 40% of their budget was coming from aid. And they were just inundated with different donors, one after the other. A typical case of being overburdened by the presence of donors, even though it was aid that was much needed. So they had made a policy resolution there that they'd have nobody coming from the outside of their country to discuss anything on development in the first 3 months of the year. It was called quiet time, so that they could actually think through what Tanzania needed before this tsunami of donors and foundations came. And then along came Nigeria with a rather big delegation. But we did take away the importance of data there. We took away the importance of the Accountant General's office, the Auditor General's office, the importance, in fact, of the university and the think tanks that were there and contributing to their virtual poverty fund. The one thing that we had that they didn't have, so their virtual poverty fund was not quite off the drawing board. We had money, and money to put through this, $1 billion that we talked about. But it took us a lot longer to try to get our data and institutions in place. We did go back. We did try to put this $1 billion through every year. I have to tell you that in the first year, we did not spend almost any of that money. And that was because we were unable to put that money through the system. There was not enough planning capacity. It was an incredibly difficult thing to go back to people in Nigeria and to say to them that, we didn't spend the $1 billion. It was a good thing to say we didn't steal it. And here it is. It's still in the account. But, it was very difficult to tell Nigerians who were dying in childbirth, who were not able to get to school, who couldn't have access to water, that for a deficit in institutions and their capacity to spend these resources, they didn't get that. That was a very painful part of that lesson. But it was a lesson that we needed to have in a federal system, because we had to explain that this was not about, in a federal level at the top, just dispensing money and not knowing what happened at the local level. It really was about how did we help strengthen the institutions at the local level and then come to that regional level and then, of course, the federal level. And for a long time, people had convinced the president that, no, the best way down was this way. We eventually managed to demonstrate to him that for every $10 that we spent in education, less than $1 reached the school. And for that, we were able then to embark upon some innovative financing, even within our country, which was called the conditional grants to states. And that leveraged a lot of compliance with governance, with accountability, with a better use of funds to health, to education, to water. And this is what I would say the MDGs opened up. It allowed us to massage what we needed to do of those goals to try to attain them. It did, in the end, also build, I think, a lot of trust in government that this could happen. One of the first challenges, of course, that we had was that on the executive side of government, there are 3 arms of government: the executive, the legislative, and, of course, the parliament, the judiciary. And the parliament, this is a lot of money. And we have a lot of parliamentarians. And for them, they needed to see the dividend of democracy in their constituencies and in most of their lives. And to have $1 billion that they didn't quite understand where it was going, that was our first barrier, that we have to go to Parliament to have this appropriated. It was not a money that the President could just appropriate. And they did not have any structure to look at this. So for the best part of that year that I also spoke to you, that we didn't spend very much money, I spent most of the time running around 15 different committees just to address the MDGs. And the one thing that you will know about parliaments is that they never reduce the number of committees. They will always be increased, and every one of them has to have a budget line. So it made it very difficult for us to get any coherence, very difficult for us to get any accountability on any line for that. And in the end, what we managed to persuade them to do was to create the first parliamentary committee on the MDGs that brought all of those sectors, health, education, agriculture, water, you name it, gender, they all came into that committee. And so we had that one-stop shop. Didn't quite make it at the Senate level, theirs was ad hoc, but together, what was important is at the lower level of the House in my country, that's where the decision is taken on expenditure. That helped. That really did help for us to get to the grassroots, a better understanding of an agenda, that development framework that was not legally binding. How did we in fact speak to the Parliament about it? I have to tell you, we fudged the truth. We didn't quite tell them it wasn't legally binding, so it was convenient to let them think that it was. And that, I think, helped us. We came up against a couple of really hard decisions. By the time, in the second, I suppose, 2-3 years down the line of the debt relief, the second president I served, he had a very major challenge. We had what we call in our parliaments, and this for governance, it's an important part of what you need to know in our parliaments. I think they have them in the US, they call them pork barrel projects. I don't know what you call them in Germany, but I think every parliament has one sort or another. Ours were called constituency projects. In the past, they would just get budget allocations. And in this case, they wanted their budget allocation from the MDGs. And the one thing that we were not going to allow was a budget allocation from the MDGs. We were very clear that this was not to be touched. This 1% that we got for the poor was going to stay just like that. But we did have to compromise. And the compromise that we made was actually to sit down and design a constituency project framework for our parliamentarians, because the alternative was to stop the budget for the next few years. And what did we do with that framework? We managed to get them to agree that in every constituency around Nigeria, it's probably one project that's gone to every nook and corner of the country, 774 local governments, that they would have a budget allocation to each one of them, and they would spend it on health, on education, and on agriculture and water. And that's exactly what they did. They either built additional classrooms, they made portable water available, they had primary healthcare centers, they put in drug revolving schemes. In fact, we got them in touch with the people, and we delivered on the MDGs through the constituency projects. So in black and white, that was probably not the right thing to do, because constituency projects should be the whole budget. They should be actually delivering to people. But in this particular case, we tried to do the best we could in a bad situation. And in fact, that was probably the best part of the spending on MDGs, was that every corner got it. We did deliver in terms of water. It opened up a lot, as I said, of issues around how much needed to be invested in institutions. It was something that when they had seen a year of non-budget performance on the MDG resources, that they then agreed that they would take 5-10% of it and invest it in institutions. In civil servants, we actually had to go back to the civil service, back to the training schools, look at the modules. We focused on 4 areas. We said we needed to deliver service in education, health, agriculture, finance. And that's what we started to do with over 150,000 civil servants over a period of 2.5 years. That did help. We did spend money better. They began to realize their partners in the state and local government needed some help, and they helped to do that. Painful way to go, but it did happen. But it also opened up to them the need for consultation in many of the programs and projects that we had, not to think at the federal level because we had the expertise, that we actually knew better for people at the local level. That consultation was incredibly important. Whether it was a primary health care center, that they thought the best thing to do was to have additional housing within the primary health care center to make sure that nurses and doctors could stay around for the patients, and then only to find out that in fact that just separated families and they got less and less people coming to those centers. Or as I walked into one rural area where we had provided water and was very excited to see a local herdsman and, say to him, how does this work for you? And now we'd separated where livestock got water, we separated where the human beings got their water from. And he said to me, well, he doesn't really understand, but he's not sure about this water. And I thought, what's wrong with this water? So I drank the water, and he said, no, 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 no. You see, the water that I've been on for all these years and my cattle have been on, there's been nothing wrong with this, is red. It's a brown, reddy color. Now you've given us this clear water. What's in it? Simple thing that we had just thought that by providing potable water, and he would understand that this was the best water he could possibly have. He didn't trust us. He didn't trust government. He didn't trust to give it to his cows, nor him to talk less himself, until we drank it and proved to him that this is actually how it should be. And that was important. Same with another village. Go to the village. We had not had a consultation with them. We just put in a borehole, provided water, gone to see, make sure that it was working. That was my concern. Is it working? It was working, it was great, and everybody was clapping, and I was being given a chicken, and I was being given something else, and I was saying, so this is really good for you, got more water, and they say, yes, it's very good for washing the pots and pans. Washing the pots and pans, what about drinking it? No, 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 we don't drink this water. What do you mean you don't drink this water? We drink the one over there. And that was a bore well that had been put down by the Rotary, but it had been given to 2 young people who got an earning from that borehole. And we hadn't put that we hadn't factored that they would lose an income, and so therefore would protect the income. So they convinced the village that the clean water that we had put there really was just for their implements, and it was not good for drinking, and this was the drinking water. We managed to find them alternative employment and make sure that the community benefited. But delivery of service, the whole governance issue around that was very important, that who was paying for what, how. We had huge results in being able, first of all, to instill a message that we were going to use public resources well, and we were going to be monitored. We, at the beginning, there are government mechanisms for monitoring. My experience with civil society was that was not going to work. Government would always provide a tool or a framework that would measure its success. It would never provide one that measured its failure or its shortcomings. So we put together civil society and business, and we asked architects and engineers to really see if we had delivered in terms of value for money. Had we, in fact, with contractually set up contracts, we had built the schools according to specification, because I can tell you we hadn't done in the past. And then we asked civil society to go find out if, in fact, those services delivered a service. Did the hospital deliver to pregnant women? Did the schools, in fact, where children, especially girls, able to access an education? Big eye-opener for us in many cases, but it did improve things. When people knew someone was going to come and look over their shoulder, they then practiced and delivered on the contract. We didn't get less cement in the sand so that our blocks were completely porous. People knew somebody was going to come and measure it. What was even better was that even when the primary healthcare centres were built well, we found out that in consultations with many of the communities, these were never placed in the places that they would deliver service. We had one primary healthcare centre on the top of a hill. The woman would have delivered before she got there. And then we found out it was next door to the local government chairman's home. So we managed to change a lot of that. What we did was instill accountability, a sense of accountability. There were checks and balances. We were coming. And this is really what we take into the post-2015s, experiences like this, knowing that implementation on the ground is a totally different thing. You can write the best theory you like. Once you get to the country level, how are you going to adapt it? How is it going to be a post-2015 agenda that is transitional, that we move from a poverty focus and ODA with maybe some domestic resources, making all of this work better, look at a much bigger agenda and be looking for other resources beyond ODA, which is difficult enough, to say that you will spend on this and that you would have accountability in place, knowing that institutions are weak. It has to be a transition. We have to know that somewhere along the line, institutions have to be strengthened, capacities have to be built, things that we take for granted here. I don't believe that there are any businesses in Europe that would invest in countries that didn't have a baseline data. Yet for decades, we have been investing in our developing countries without baseline data, with surveys that are usually at 5-year intervals, 3 years late. And they really are just that, they're surveys. So you can't specifically say where people are, and you have all these middle-income countries growing, but leaving so many people behind. In fact, most of our poor are actually in middle-income countries. So the issue of inequality, absolutely huge on that. And that's really where we come to talk about the post-2015, transitioning from the MDGs. What we've learned in terms of governance and accountability, the rule of law. If we are in emerging democracies, then we have to know that there are many things that need to be put in place, and we have to perhaps look for a way within the framework. We're talking about sustainable development now. We're looking at eradicating poverty in 15 years by using an integrated strategy when we say social inclusion, economic inclusion and transformation, and then the environment, protecting our planet, its people and planet. And to do that, to eradicate poverty. That's a transition, because the MDGs are unfinished business. And yet many of the challenges we have there will have to walk its way through. We still have our women dying in childbirth. We don't have parity with our girls in school as yet, and we're already asking for the next level. But going to the next agenda will require that everyone is on board, and saying that you're going to leave no one behind is a huge claim, big ambition. Not only does it require much more capacity to go to scale, the resources that it will require quite considerable. So on both sides, we have to find a way that we can produce a framework that actually looks at a set of goals that are not. A year ago, we asked the world what they would like to see. We had asks of about 150 goals. And we all knew that 8 goals of the MDGs were really what worked for us. So now we're down to 19 focus areas. I'll explain a little bit later on what the process is in the United Nations to get to those goals. But it's clearly understanding what are our emerging challenges, what are the existing ones, and how do we get a framework with a set of goals that hopefully doesn't go beyond what you can count on 2 hands, because honestly, politicians won't bother after that. Everything else will fall off the edge. And how do we get an integrated whole, sufficient education, sufficient health, enough that addresses the issues of women and girls, that through the whole of this is a rights-based agenda, that we look at economic transformation, investing in clean energy, infrastructure, what about the cities and the demographics that we talk about, and then how do we do the means of implementation for that, and ensure that everyone, as we say, gets on board. Maybe the leaving no one behind, we had the high-level panel report that really spoke to leaving no one behind and gave a set of illustrative goals that we thought would address that. The best illustration I saw of leaving no one behind, but the challenges of governance, was a visit to Nauru. Nauru is a tiny island off the coast of 4.5 hours, I think, by air off the coast of Australia. It has 10,000 people. It's the smallest member of the UN family. And for me, this was really the litmus test. Our attention to Nauru would, in fact, be the measure we should use for how serious we are about leaving no one behind. On an island that had had great wealth, but had it exploited, it had it really basically decimated by bad leadership. This is an island that the extractive industries now showed that there was no place on that island. In fact, I think maybe 1 or 2 small patches where you could grow anything. Climate change had taken its toll around it. So the sea around it was no longer delivering either. They were either competing with dolphins for the tuna that it had, or that the reef itself had lost the periwinkles, as it were. They had to dive deep for it. But more importantly, you had a community with 95% diabetes, type A, and you had just over that in terms of obesity. You had education systems that, in fact, the Australian government helped with, but there was no future, so people didn't, they went in, they signed up, and they didn't continue. So people didn't see the value of education. That was a wasted investment. You had a democracy that was rather odd. The president there could decide whether he would call or not call Parliament to discuss. So the opposition, we were not sure quite why it was there. Where we had issues around the rest of the world, in Africa in particular, we always talked about the access that women needed to land so that they could really get on with empowerment. In this particular case, Nauru, the people own the land. And in many cases, they wouldn't let the government have the land for health facilities or for education facilities. So everything was on top of its head. And then it was so far away that perhaps certain governments thought we wouldn't notice when they put centres up there for migrants that were passing through. And some of those migrants, quite frankly, the numbers that we saw coming into that island were going to cause a huge change. So what could we do to really challenge Nauruans to take their own destiny in hand and know that the outside world would try to help them do that if they were trying to right wrongs. That's a work in progress, but it is something that we want to watch because it is really a measure of, how do they get their governance right, and then how do they deliver, and how are people brought into understanding that even with the power of land, they also need to negotiate for those services and make sure that they get delivery. So for this, as I would say, really ambitious development framework to take place, it cannot be business as usual. It's a universal agenda. It means that we are no longer speaking to a global governance framework that just talks about countries. And so those that give ODA have a set of conditions to ensure that those resources are used well. This is about partnering for very, very, very major investments in economies that require for us to look both ways. And I say this because in Nigeria, I can talk about the governance agenda and I can talk about corruption, and it's still a work in progress that we're trying to get right. And I know that when things don't work in my country, women die in childbirth, we don't get the services that we are due, and we certainly don't grow and include people the way we should with the kind of wealth that we have. And that affects Nigeria and 169 million people. But when you get the global governance wrong and you have a financial crisis, the tsunami hits everyone. It takes time in some places and others. And you saw it hit Europe, you saw it hit Africa, we saw it all the way through the world. So we need a governance agenda that calls everyone to order, that puts checks and balances in for everyone. And this is one of the most difficult things to try to articulate. And as we sit talking in the Development Committee Forum, it's a tough nut to crack, is that who are the new stakeholders, first and foremost? Do we recognize that we have partners now beyond government? It's not just government and donors. It is about civil society who are actually delivering on service in many cases. The newcomers of parliaments, parliaments who have oversight, but also at the same time who oversights parliament, ensures that they deliver to people, ensures that in fact our budgets reach where they should. Then we have business, and business are going to provide a lot for the gap that we expect. What are the checks and balances in there? Do we have institutions strong enough at the country level to really look at a partnership between government and business, making sure that as you exploit extractive industries for our countries, that you find people at the center benefiting from that and not looking from the outside in. And a story I have here is in one of our African countries. As we went there, young people had said to me, yes, they're doing really well in their country and they love their president, doing a great job, but there's a big problem with the extractive industries. They have, in one space of land, they have many commodities. So that's a supermarket for them that they can go and they have access to. Overnight, that commodity turned into one item in the supermarket, and they don't have access to it. So they were not included in the fact that we saw many items that they farmed at that local level. Suddenly that land being claimed for one commodity that was being exported. Yes, revenues came into the country, but those revenues did not generate back into those communities to help them or give them an alternative. So they ended up looking from the outside in. So how do you involve them to make sure that you don't get unholy alliances between government and business, and that people are at the middle of, are at the center of this? The business doesn't come off the face of poverty. Business wonders, it looks at the bottom line. That's what it does. And you have to recognize that. But that bottom line can be with people at the center. People can benefit, and business can benefit, and we've got many examples of champions for that. And so that is another part of the whole governance structure that needs to take this big paradigm shift of looking at a much more broader agenda. We know that our member states now have come to a realization that the next development agenda is going to be a universal one. It's going to be one set of goals, and what we call them at the end, we will see. I have to say, a lot of young people say to me, sustainable development goals, what does that mean? So I think we're going to have a competition to call them something, but we will get one set of goals that embraces the dimensions of sustainable development. And there is, for the first time, a recognition that we have to have governance, the rule of law, peace, all important as enablers and important development outcomes for sustainable development. And we know that conflict and violence in our countries is different across the regions that we want to talk about today. We're talking about our 5 regions. The kind of conflict that we address in Africa is certainly different from that that's addressed in Latin America. And how do we look at that? How do we put in the checks and balances to try to see that everyone comes in here? And a lot of the violence that we talk about, we often look to women, we look to children in conflict areas, and we really try to see how we can address all of that. And it will have major implications for institutions and how they cope with that. We know that democratic governance is inseparable from the rule of law, yet these two words can almost stop a negotiation: democracy and the rule of law. And we have to remember that this is not a boardroom you go into with a few directors that you have to convince. It's 193 member countries. And 193 member countries have to get consensus. And we have two processes where we have perhaps 70 representing the 193, and in the finance on the other side we have even less. So how do we get around discussing governance, the governance agenda? We're convinced that if we can push for how important it is in delivering a service to have institutions to underpin that, that's what it means: sustainable development, eradicating poverty, and making sure it's irreversible. The irreversible bit is the investment that we make in people and institutions, systems. That's slowly beginning to gain some traction. The rule of law, certainly we recognize that that's important, but we have to find a different way to communicate that. Access to justice, making parliaments understand that without the rule of law, they cannot execute the appropriation bill. They cannot provide the instruments that we are going to need to facilitate investments come into the country. If we talk about tax havens, as we do now, as a main channel for getting resources back, we have to have stronger, more robust tax systems in our countries. That means we have to invest in them. Those are institutions, and laws will have to come to be made in place of that. And frankly, we don't have those sort of capacities, and that's the kind of message that we're sending back. It's the same with the human rights agenda. And we know that the UN for us is built on peace and security, human rights and development. But the human rights agenda is also taking its toll. And often that is because, again, the rule of law is not present, and so has to be. Growing our democracies and deepening our democracies also needs that. And there's a complicated discussion on what that, how we go about that. And we've highlighted that in the Secretary General's report, in A Life of Dignity for All, and we hope that he's going to, at least our messages will get across that transparency is going to be important, and reporting both sides in all of this, and that somehow we can hold local authorities as key actors ensuring accountability and participatory governance. The UN Millennium Declaration, I mean, people say to me, so what is it that's going to bind everyone together? The UN Millennium Declaration that we had in 2000 is still as valid today as it was then. There are many aspects of it that we didn't even apply, and it has identified democracy and participatory governance as one of the 6 fundamental values. I think we need to go back to that value system and really reinforce and recommit to all of that. Certainly in the recent reports that we've all had, and hopefully you have access to them, we have reiterated a lot of that. There are still various options, and we hope that we will look at a standalone goal that is being proposed. There is consensus around that. The fact that you would even get governance on a development agenda is ambitious enough. I mean, many will say it's not ambitious enough and we need to do more. But you'll be surprised, as I said, the word rule of law, democracy, governance can shut down a negotiation. What we want to do is to open up the door to the possibilities, to do what we did with the MDGs, which was take them as a baseline and not a ceiling, that we open up the door to governance, that we talk about institutions, that we then in our countries can raise the ambition for how that should happen. Finally, let me just talk a little bit about understanding the complexity of this development framework. We had 3 years to put a development framework in place, which member states own. We're halfway through that now. 2 major processes. And many of you, I'm sure, if you haven't, certainly many, many youth around the world, in fact, many million, I should say now, have given us their input into the world they would like to see. So inputs into that process we are hearing loud and clear. The Open Working Group finishes its work in September this year. It hands to the General Assembly a set of goals. Together with that comes a financing framework from the experts group. And that's with their outreach to tell us this is a framework that we think you will need for a development agenda. The Secretary General, and this is where our work comes in, gets to pull together a report. It's called a synthesis report. So all the different issues that I hear today, that we hear through the Open Working Group, through the Finance Group, through many other channels, come to form the basis of the final negotiation, which then takes about 9 months to get to where it needs to get to. September 2015 is when we have a new framework. And there's a lot of pressure, a lot of understanding, many of the implications for a new development framework that are not yet understood and that need to be understood. And I hope today, when we interact this evening, you will ask the questions that need to be asked. Even if they sound like they don't belong in this room, ask them. Because no one really has been through a process where 193 countries determine the future of the next development framework. What we've had is a sign-off on a prescription. This time you have members in New York who mostly are from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if not development planning, and we're asking them to be experts on health, on education, on empowerment, and maybe they'll get there, maybe they won't, but we have to inform that process. I'm absolutely sure that we're going to get a development framework by September 2015. What I'm not sure about is whether the ambition of that framework will be such that it can respond to the challenges and the complexities of this world. And that then, if we don't get that, we would say, well, then what's the use of multilateralism? This is a big test for multilateralism. Are we better together or apart? I'm convinced we're better together. I think we need leadership and we need political will, and we need to hear the voices demanding that, because this world, for far too long, has suffered, as the Pope says, we've now become a globalization of indifference. And that has to change. That has to change. People have to matter. And if people don't matter, then people and planet is no longer a reality, and we all know what that means. But I think that there is that possibility. What I really hope that we will all fight for is an ambition for an agenda that will make a difference to all of us, especially in this room. Thank you.